Hello again. Let's start the program. This is the 76th session of the film virtual discussion. Our guest, Mr. Brian, who is joining us. And our movie tonight is Time to Live and a Time to Die by Sha-Shien. Before starting the program, I just have a couple of announcements for PCC program upcoming next couple of weeks. We have a new event, new program called Three Chefs in the Kitchen. It's a special program for upcoming Nowruz. And on Saturday, March 13, at 2 p.m. you can join via Zoom and you can learn about how to cook sabzi polo mahi and dessert loaves, the famous dish for the Nowruz, the New Year. And of course, we are going to celebrate the Nowruz on March 19, Friday night at 8 p.m. The great band Rastak will join and have a program, and also we have Persian Academy Dance will perform, and we have some special guests as well. So join us on Friday, 8 p.m. via Instagram, via Facebook, and via YouTube. And also, we are going to have rerun of this program the next day after at 9:30 a.m. So if you missed it, you can always join us the next day after as well. Okay, back to our program. Tonight's film, as I mentioned, is the Time to Live and Time to Die by Sha-Shien. Is one of the great Taiwanese film director, producer, and writer, and also actor. He was born on 1947, and is among us. We are great that he is a living legend of the Taiwan. Also, this film is part of the trilogy of the coming ages. I'm sure that Brian is going to have to talk about great in details about it. Let me introduce Brian. Brian, who is the artistic director of the Pacific Art Movement, the presenter of the San Diego Asian Film Festival. As many of you probably know, and we always enjoying two festival every year. He also assistant professor of the television, film, and new media at San Diego State University. He is the author of the book Worldly Desire, Cosmopolitanism and Cinema in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And he also the co-host of the Asian American Film podcast, Saturday School. And he has also edited a special section of the journals, Film Quarterly, and Cinema Journals. And his writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Times and San Diego Union Tribune. Brian, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and thanks for coming tonight and being our guest speaker. The microphone is all yours. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. It was a very easy invitation to accept because, well, first of all, it's always great to see you all, if not at our festival, then virtually. But also because when I'm thinking about like the communities in San Diego who just love movies, like your group comes immediately to mind. Like there's a few in San Diego who are just people who love movies. They love watching movies. They love going to watch movies. They love talking about movies. And you're one of the most like kind of fervent lovers of cinema. And so I just want to be part of that enthusiasm and passion. So that's why I'm here tonight. And when I was invited to pick any movie, it's always such like a daunting task because part of it is these movies are so personal. Right, like the love for movies, you know, cinephilia is itself like fundamentally a subjective experience. like sometimes the movies that we love the most are the ones that are hardest to explain to somebody, like what your love is, because they think you're they don't understand you, or because it becomes from such a personal place. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a little bit about the context of this film in terms of Taiwanese history, and then also the history of Taiwanese cinema. But I also want to kind of foreground it's my own kind of personal connection with the movie, and like, well, and why it's special to me. And the exciting thing is, like, I've met people all around the world who've also singled out this movie as one that's very personal to them. So that's, and then through all of this, I hope that if you all have questions, or you want to speak to each other about what you experienced watching this movie. First of all, it's like it's amazing that this movie is even available to watch. I first watched this movie. I think I was a freshman in college, and this is like before you can stream movies online. But our university library had a VHS tape of this movie, and I'd always read about this movie. I remember I'd never seen the Sha-Shין movie before. I didn't really know what to expect. I went to the university library. I went to the basement where the media library was, and I watched the VHS tape. And at the end of it, I was like bawling, and I didn't understand why. And it was in going through the history of Taiwan cinema, and then also connecting that with the history of my family, that I'm still kind of discovering why I was so moved by it that first time I watched it, and why I continue to be moved by it. So a little bit about myself. My parents moved to the United States from Taiwan before I was born. And so I was born in the United States. And for me, Taiwan was sort of a figment of the imagination. I'd gone there a couple of times when I was younger. And my parents, they spoke to each other in Mandarin, but they spoke to their parents in Taiwanese. And I spoke to my parents in a mixture of English and Mandarin. And so that's kind of my like distant connection with Taiwan, especially at the time. So that's kind of where I came in to watching the film. All right, so I'll come back to that story, but I want to go backwards a little bit of the political background. This film it was not released by a US distributor, so it doesn't have like a titles in the beginning that explains to an American audience what's happening. So I assume some of you know a little bit about Taiwan's history, but in any case, I'll say a little bit. I mean, originally, Taiwan is a place where a lot of people have been, like a lot of different cultures, a lot of different governments, a lot of economies have staked a claim in Taiwan. But we should acknowledge that all the way in the beginning, there were indigenous people in Taiwan. But around the 1600s or so, I mean, like sprinkled throughout the history, but especially like escalating to the 1600s or so, you have more and more people from China moving to Taiwan. And Taiwan's like a little island off the southeast coast of China. Around this time, you also have colonizers from the Netherlands, from Spain, from Portugal. Some of you may remember that for a while Taiwan was known as Formosa, and that had to do with the Portuguese that came to Taiwan who named it that. So you have colonizers essentially from China, from various places in Europe. On top of that, you have the indigenous people. So through the centuries after that, you have the Chinese people especially become the dominant population in Taiwan. And after a while, they start seeing themselves as locals. They see themselves as people who are born and raised and with a very distinct identity. All right, so that's happening in Taiwan. In the late 1800s, Japan becomes the colonizer too, and for 50 years, the first half of the 20th century, Japan was the colonizer of Taiwan. So a lot of people had their turn colonizing Taiwan. So that's sort of the history. That's sort of the ethos of the nation, a nation that is constantly in search of who are we. Well, things came to a head in the 1940s. So before the 1940s, as many of you know, in China, you have two parties that are fighting for dominance. You have the Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, and then you have the Republic of China, which is the KMT party, the Kuomintang party. And they had a civil war after World War II. And the Communist Party defeated the Republic of China. And and they set up their own government, which is the People's Republic of China that we now know as the ruling nation in China. And then that expelled the Republic of China. They went to Taiwan, and they sort of set up in Taiwan as their new home base. And they really thought about it as a temporary home base, that they were just going to be in Taiwan for a little bit, and then when they get the resources back, when the United States government supports the Republic of China, they're going to go back to the mainland and they're going to take it over again. Of course, there's people in Taiwan already who are saying, like, why did you, like, who are you? You just arrived, you think you own this place. That will be the subject of future Shao-Shen movies, that tension. But here, what we're capturing right now is that interesting moment in the late 1940s when you have like military people coming from China, retreating from China to Taiwan. You have politicians retreating. But you also have just regular people who, like, maybe you know somebody who knows somebody who's going to Taiwan, and you just you hear it's pretty good over there, and you say, hey, you know what? I'm gonna tag along for a bit. Maybe I can raise my children in another place for a little bit. They didn't necessarily see Taiwan as a different country. It was just another island that their people were at for a while, but they followed along. So they weren't all rich people. They weren't all powerful people, and that's the story of Hou Xiaoxin's own family. As I mentioned, so like when they arrived in Taiwan, it caused a lot of tension. In the 1950s, the Republic of China basically took over the country. They set up their own government. They took over from what the Japanese left. The Japanese developed a lot of infrastructure in Taiwan. The Republic of China government, the KMT government, they inherited it, and then they continued to develop and modernize Taiwan and its people. But part of their project was to kind of convert the people in Taiwan into allegiance to China and allegiance to their idea of China, the Republic of China's notion. That part of that was having everybody learn Mandarin. Before, there was nobody in Taiwan speaking Mandarin. And it was also like changing their history, the way they learn history. Now everybody in school, before they used to learn Japanese, now they learn Mandarin. Before they learned Japanese history, now they learned the history according to the Republic of China. Another big thing they learned was that the enemy was the communists. So this is the kind of indoctrination that happened in the 1950s and 60s. And it spread into film. The film industry in Taiwan was developed largely as an organ of the propaganda of the nationalist government that was there. And so these films are all in Mandarin because they wanted people to learn Mandarin. They all kind of espoused healthy values. They actually use the word healthy. They're often about being filial to your parents, but also being filial by extension to the government. In Chinese, the word for family and the word for nation actually shares the same character. And so this idea of a healthy family equals a healthy government. And so these are the kind of values, very Confucian values, that they were trying to instill in Taiwan. And those are the kinds of films that were being made. And some of them are pretty good. You watch them now, and it's like clearly propaganda, but they're like singing and dancing, and everyone looks beautiful, and you know, happy endings. And then sometimes there are war movies where they defeat the communists and that sort of thing. As you might imagine, by the 1970s, you have a younger generation that kind of grew up in Taiwan. And they're starting to think, yeah, this is strange that we're still being fed this kind of material. Like, we grew up in Taiwan. We have no nostalgia for China like our parents do. And so they start having their own ideas about, wait, maybe Taiwan doesn't belong. Maybe the identity of Taiwan is way more complicated. At the same time, they're starting to tire of the propaganda films. And they stopped watching them. They started watching Hollywood films and Hong Kong films. And the Taiwanese cinema industry started to go into decline. So in the early 1980s, the Taiwanese government realized, okay, we need to do things differently. Maybe we need to start attracting new kinds of talent. One area that they looked for talent was in literature. There were literary movements at the time that were very open to the idea that Taiwan was undergoing some kind of radical shift in their psyche. It was kind of an aimless generation, a drifting generation, and a generation that didn't know where they came from. It's sort of like they were told one thing by the government. Their parents seemed to be nostalgic for a world that they don't recognize. And then meanwhile, they have all this American culture. And so they don't really know who they are anymore. And that kind of ethos became adapted into a lot of films that were starting to be made in the early 1980s. This is the birth of a film movement called the Taiwan New Cinema. Around 1981, 1982, you have films that are suddenly very interested in, how did we grow up, right? How did we see the world as young people growing up in Taiwan? Whereas our parents, they talked about growing up in China. We wanted to finally tell the story of what it's like to grow up in Taiwan. And their story was radically different than the stories that were being told in the previous generation. For one, they rejected the fact that there could just be one language. And you started to hear the Taiwanese language more and more in these films. This also corresponded with the 1980s, where in Taiwan, you just have the liberalization of culture. Like 20 years before that, if you said any of this, you would go to jail. If you wanted to say, like, I'm going to tell a different story than the one the government prefers. But by the 1980s, they started relaxing. And then by 1987, martial law ends in Taiwan. So the film that we watched for today is sort of those films that were being made in that middle section, between the propaganda and before the true liberalization and opening of how you can talk about the government. And so, I mean, so you have all these young filmmakers who have all these new ideas, but they're sort of afraid to be too explicit about their politics. And so they retreated into stories about young people, because young people, they're just kids, right? Like, they don't have politics. But so much of the politics is ingrained in how families interact with each other. And the director, Shا-Shין, came up. Yeah, he actually started making movies in the 1970s when it was still a little bit of the entertainment propaganda kind of filmmaking. But quickly, especially when he started to meet all of these people from literature, he decided to take on some of their ideas. And then he quickly became probably the leader in that movement. Okay, so before I go on further, I wanted to show you two clips. First is a clip from a 1970, actually this is from 1980. So this is like the tail end of that sort of Hollywood-inspired, like, good values, propaganda style filmmaking. Although this one, by now, by the 1980s, like, the holds of propaganda was starting to loosen. So this movie is a little bit more like a soap opera. But you can sense from the style what the style of Taiwan filmmaking was like before. And then immediately after that, I'll show you a clip from the movie you watched for today, A Time to Live and A Time to Die. Okay, so the whole thing is about 3 minutes between the two clips. Okay, so that's the first clip. And then this second clip you'll recognize.
一同上西要求，不准搭跌落。cái時候，唐人講， nằm ra lại 就阿亲姑，阿亲姑同阿琴用啥穷年，迄个年唔叫阿琴成吞年，我阿亲姑说，阿琴吞年嘅时候啊，他很美，妈妈念念哦，也讲到啊。變到面中後背，唔敢出聲。有一日，阿婆帶阿琴去止痛了，使到個精神嘅東西無槍，因阿妹又餓又餓，我想帶佢門煙又暗煙呢。就从药铺的拿药的讲解室，吃了有自备的，咿呀的，肚子硬硬的，听你就是的。
Okay. So I mean, they're sort of wildly different kinds of movies, despite being from the same country and only 5 years apart. But both films are about mothers talking to daughters. In both films, they're mothers talking to daughters about a child who's died. And both films kind of allude to what's outside the window, and then both kind of discover that differently. I mean, most obviously, right? In the first clip, it's so hyper melodramatic. It's a soap opera. The way it's shot, the lighting everything's very pronounced, exaggerated. The acting style is very exaggerated. But it's also kind of fun to watch. It's just like salacious. Like you get the sense that this daughter is just her heart is being cut out by her mom, who doesn't care for her, only cares about her dead child. And like the music, the weather kind of comes in, like the thunder comes in right when it hurts the most. And it's classic Hollywood style melodrama that we see all over the world, really. And then suddenly in the second clip, again, only 5 years separated these two movies. Like that's how quickly Taiwan cinema discovered a new way of what movies can do in this Taiwan new cinema movement. I mean, most famously, in all of Ho Xiaoshen's films, you get a very, very long take. Like the camera doesn't cut for a very, very long time. In fact, that clip that I showed you was only maybe like half of that scene. If you recall, it was a very long conversation. In this scene, like it just sounds different. The weather sounds like it would if you were sitting there. Like the weather isn't pronounced according to the emotion. Even the way the mom tells the story, I remember, like, I don't know what about you, but like every time I watch the movie, I'm so like in awe of how they wrote this, because she's just rambling. Like you can't tell while she's telling the story where she's going with the story. Whereas in the first clip, as soon as she's starting to talk about like somebody else, you know exactly what the emotion of the scene is supposed to be. In A Time to Live and A Time to Die, you're often sort of just wondering, like, so am I supposed to cry now? Even though she's telling this sort of horrendous story, like the emotions aren't quite so obvious. I didn't show it, but like earlier in that scene, if you remember, they're having this like heartfelt conversation between mother and daughter. And in the middle, you actually hear the brother, the main character, singing in another room. And then the sister says, "Stop singing, it sounds terrible." But sort of like, why interrupt such a moving moment with like a frivolous throwaway, like scene, like a message to your pesky brother? But it's moments like that that remind us, like this is a different kind of realism at play, like a realism that is the rhythm of everyday life, the rhythm of like just how a story would be told from mother to daughter. A mother who's not necessarily a great storyteller, she just has something to tell her daughter. I mean, that's like most stories that my mom tells me are very rambling, and I don't know I'm not sure what she's getting at with it. But that's how we recognize. That's at least how I recognize, you know, the way that family talks to each other. Of course, it's also a very kind of melancholy family. The camera's also very far from them. Whereas in the first clip, you get their faces. You get a close-up of how horrified they are of what's going on. Whereas here, like, it's rather dark. Like the best lit part of the scene is actually what's outside. It's the rain, it's nature. And the scene ends with actually a cut of just watch rain outside a window for a little bit. So it's a different kind of, we're reflecting on different moments of the physical world. And so what people were quickly picking up on with this new Taiwan cinema was a respect for organic time and space, that the way we actually experience our lives. And then for Taiwan at this time, this is hugely political, right? This idea that we are not going to go by the incredibly manufactured history of our world and the manufactured way that we're supposed to think about being a good daughter or being a good sister. Here, we're just gonna see how it actually played out. So it's like a non-intervention that seems like it's apolitical, but it's a non-intervention that is actually very, very political in a country that has for so long not allowed reality to come out to the surface. Because the reality in Taiwan was people didn't speak Mandarin, not at home at least, but in every single movie they were speaking in Mandarin at home. A Time to Live and a Time to Die is remarkable in that the family speaks 3 languages to each other. So the grandmother, and then the parents, they moved from a part of China that spoke the Hakka language. And then they moved to Taiwan, and then they were even minorities within minorities because not everyone spoke Hakka. So this is a great scene when the grandmother, who keeps getting lost, she's at like a outdoor little, like a picnic table, and she's trying to tell these other neighbors that she wants to go visit some bridge. And the neighbors keep saying, what is she saying? I don't understand. And they ask her, like, do you understand what she's saying? It's because she's speaking a completely different language. And the locals were speaking Taiwanese. So then you get the sense that, and so you see the parents, the grandmother, they speak in Hakka because of where the village they came from in China. The next generation, including the main character, Aha, he speaks in Taiwanese because he hangs out with all these Taiwanese guys and all these like wannabe gangsters. And a lot of them are locals because those who don't have access to education, like they tend to be local people, the people who were here for generations, and they all speak Taiwanese. Whereas the older sister, who is the most educated of all of them, she speaks Mandarin. So she's actually starting to buy in with a lot of the new ideology and kind of culture of education that the recent immigrants from China were bringing in. So within one family, you have 3 dialects happening at all times, and which only adds to the sense that no one is talking to each other. Like there's so few scenes in the movie where anyone talks to each other. I mean, like that scene that I showed you is a real exception to this. Otherwise, you really see the characters in their own worlds. A lot of Sha-shin's films famously just like have fathers who are absent. And so you just wonder like, oh, is this just another movie about a father who doesn't know how to be a father? And the really powerful thing at the end of the movie was you realize that there are reasons why he was absent. And one of the reasons perhaps is that he doesn't speak the same language as his son. That scene when the son comes back from school and he wants to tell his dad that he passed the test. And he keeps telling the dad, I passed the test. And the dad's like, I don't understand what you mean. And so it's not just a case where a stereotypical father who's just never thinks his son is good enough. It's not that. It's actually because of just the unique, awkward cultural situation of Taiwan at the time. Families were falling apart. And so a film like this is trying to say, let's use as realistic a means as possible to capture not that our families are dysfunctional, but because just the circumstances are so unusual for us. This just happens to be the world that we were born into. We would just happen to live here, and some of us happen to die here. And so that's sort of the majesty of the kind of realism that Sha-shin is in search of in a movie like this. I mean, I think he's actually working with a lot of other sentimental elements, a lot of like interesting ways of storytelling where we see something and then we hear about it later, or vice versa. So we could talk about that too. But I've been talking for a long time, and I actually would love to hear from everybody else. Just people's like initial reactions to the unique style of this movie? Or maybe you didn't find it that unique. Did it remind you of other kinds of films? Or, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Brian. I see that Mr. Beruzian raised a hand. I personally, Mr. Beruzian, I'll be with you in a moment. Personally, thank you very much for clearing up these different type of the languages, because what we read is just a subtitle, and I honestly didn't get that part that father kind of speaking some other language and the son is speaking, you know, Taiwanese. So that's a great explanation and make a lot of sense now. Mr. Beruzian, please ask your question.
Hello, everyone, and yes, Brian, thank you very much. It was very informative, and emphasizing on what Mahmoud said about the language. That's very interesting point, and it was a very important point also. But I have several questions throughout. You know, I mean, based on what you said. First of all, you said some point you said dialect, and some point you said language. So there's a difference between language and dialect. I know in Iran we have like some part of Iran they speak Farsi, but they have strong dialect that we don't understand each other, or even in the same area, this is happening. So it's totally familiar. That's one thing. The other thing was that, yeah, the mentioning about what the history of Taiwan's looking, and from this movie, which is, you know, I've heard somewhere that, first of all, the title of movie from some, in The Guardian, I've read about it, that the title is not actually conveying the real meaning of the Time to Die. It's just like they borrow it from A Time to Die, A Time to Live, and A Time to Live, and A Time to Die from an American movie. So if you would please clear on the title also. And the other thing is that I noticed that some critics actually, when they saw the movie first time, and even for me, because this is the first time I saw, I love this guy, and I follow him later on most of his movies, because it was very interesting and very close to our culture too. When I can identify with most of the characters. However, after like, you know, half an hour through the movie, I noticed that there are some similarities in terms of style of the camera standstill, long frame, of like Yasujiro Ozu, or like, you know, Ermanno Olmi, especially the Italian director, which our famous director Kiarostami is under influence of his style, or you know, even not in the concept, but in terms of like movement of the camera, like Tarkovsky, remind me of Tarkovsky, or Belatar for that matter. Long frame, you know, long plans, and, you know, sequence plans of like 25 minutes long. But it wasn't exactly like that, because there are actions, sometimes there are like happening things that you don't see that on those guys' movie. But he totally said no, he haven't even seen all. So it was interesting for me that, what would be your input? I mean, you're saying that within 5 years, all of a sudden, this style of the movie jumped from that soap opera type to this, which is very deep. And I know there's nothing happening, but underneath, there are lots of things happening. And with the magnificent actors playing that, it's just like a real life people. I mean, you were thinking that you're watching a documentary. There's a camera sitting there and you're watching a documentary, and there's whatever is happening, it's happening right there in front of you, and none of those people are actors. Those are very interesting facts, but the way you explain the culture and everything. And one more last thing is, how old is the Christianity in Taiwan? Because in the movie they are talking, I mean, the mother is talking about Jesus Christ and the lessons of Jesus Christ and all that. I always thought that Taiwanese are like, you know, more like, you know, type of Buddhism or that type of culture. But it is a very interesting movie. It's totally different. And it is a long movie, but when it ends, you feel like you're watching it for 1 hour or so. It was so powerful. And the use of light, the use of, the framing and the acting and the use of music and everything is so combined together. You don't even think that there is nothing happening, but there are actually things that are happening. Thank you very much.
Oh no, thank you for your comments and your questions, and also it's so great to hear that you did a little bit of research to like try to see some of the background here. So I'll address the items that you mentioned. First of all, the Christianity one. Yeah, there is a lot of Christianity in Taiwan, partly because of the long history of colonialism. So especially with the European influence, and also with missionaries. I don't know. I don't know too much about it, but I will say like Taiwan's not a place that has experienced a lot of religious persecution. So it is kind of like if you believe in something, then you believe in it. And I will say a lot of people, even though they're Christians, they still have a lot of kind of like local kind of Taiwanese. It's like kind of call like superstitions that are still that you wouldn't find necessarily in a Christian in say in another country like in Korea or something. Okay, so the other item that you mentioned is the title of the film. You're right. The Chinese title of the actually is just, if you translate it as a story of youth. So it's a very simple title as well. So it's not as poetic of a title. It's just very straightforward. And I think the straightforwardness of it, I think, is also speaks to just we're just going to go directly into like the fact this is how we grew up. In fact, there was another film in Taiwan around this time that the Chinese title is basically this is how we grew up. And there's another film called Growing Up, another film called In Our Time. So just like very directly trying to say, proclaim, like try to like bring back our childhood, to reclaim our childhood. Again, it just seems so apolitical, but it's a way for them to say like, no, this is how we are going to start telling our story from the very beginning. So this is actually tied a little bit to that really interesting question that you ask about Ozu and Antonioni and Tarkovsky and Bellatar, because as you know, like those filmmakers are making, oh, I mean, Ozu is 1950s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and Antonioni like 60s and 70s, Tarkovsky like into the 70s, and Bellatar like around the same time as Sha-Shin. And so what's really interesting is that, like you said, Sha-Shin claimed he had never seen any of their movies before. I will say Sha-Shin's peer, Edward Yang, some of you may know of Edward Yang's films like A Brighter Summer Day or Yi Yi. Edward Yang was, he was trained in the United States. Like he watched like Werner Herzog movies while living in the United States in the 1970s. So he was more of a cinephile. So he did go back to Taiwan, and they all like hung out at each other's houses because it was sort of like, we're young, we have a chance to make movies. Now, how do we make movies? Like they didn't really know. So they were learning from each other. So maybe Edward Yang, maybe he didn't show them these movies, but maybe he was talking about Antonioni. And Edward Yang's films are very influenced by Antonioni. So Sha-Shin, like when he's asked about this question, what he says is, I think, very interesting because it ties to the title of the film in Chinese, like that this is a story about youth. Because Sha-Shin says this is just a matter of problem solving for him. He knew he wanted to film children, and children just being children. But as you know, if you've tried to film a child before, they run all over the place. Like it's really hard to follow them, especially if you don't give them instructions. He really wanted to say, just be a kid. Just go grab that top and then spin the top. You just do whatever you want. So what he had to do was he had to keep the camera very far and then use a long angle, like a telephoto lens, and then just allow them to move around. And then within that lens, they can sort of like not stray too far, and he can move in and out. So it was a stylistic choice, and then he just leave the camera on for a long time. Like, and so for him, this was just the perfect way to film children. And then so interestingly, like Ozu was also very interested in children, and so perhaps like independently of each other, they were both coming up with solutions to capture the worlds of children and what happens in households. I mean, later on, Sha-Shin started watching Ozu films, and he was like, "Oh yeah, of course. I understand why you compare us." And in fact, his later film, Good Men, Good Women, includes a scene where one of the characters is watching Ozu's film, Late Spring. So they did kind of eventually converge. And then for the 100th anniversary of Ozu, the film studio Sochiku actually hired Sha-Shין to do a tribute to Ozu in a film called Café Lumière that was filmed in Japan. So he did eventually kind of acknowledge their affinity. Maybe it wasn't an influence, but it was an affinity for sure. But you mentioned like Bellatar. So this is also related to the way in which these films suddenly, like nobody knew about Taiwan cinema before Sha-Shìn. Like the world wasn't watching the Marigolds with their soap opera type movies. But I think because of what was happening with what we call now called slow cinema, and I mean Antonioni is a big part of this, and Tarkovsky and others, a very, very contemplative cinema where the camera is kind of you leave the camera on for something for a very long time, and then it's up to us to bring to us how we want to read the scene, and it's also like a influence of Italian neorealism. So all around the world, there was a vocabulary for thinking about slowness and for appreciating it in a way that maybe like the Taiwan New Wave cinema directors didn't even appreciate. But suddenly the rest of the world they can recognize this kind of film. And they started comparing these films to the French New Wave, to Italian neorealism, to Ozu. And then so suddenly Sha-Shìn became a really big deal on the international film festival circuit, a circuit that he was not even familiar with at all. And as some of you know, like he's become one of the major icons of global arts cinema. But there is a lot of controversy in Taiwan about how do we make sense? Like, are they influenced by the West? Are they influenced by Japan? Because obviously Europe and Japan are the former colonizers of Taiwan. So they're reluctant to give too much credit to these other cultural factors. So there's a way in which this style is homegrown, but we have to also acknowledge that there is starting to be a lot more dialogue between all of these filmmakers around the world. You also asked about dialect, which is a very, very political question, actually, in Taiwan. Is this a dialect or language? So it depends on who you ask. So if you ask the nationalist government that came from China, they would say Taiwanese and Hakka are dialects and that Mandarin is a language. Because there's a hierarchy there, right? It sounds like Mandarin is the root and everybody else is sort of spinning off of Mandarin. Well, if you look at the history of Mandarin, it's actually a newer language or dialect than Taiwanese or Hakka. It was developed later on. So this is where it gets kind of political. So it's like, should we think about these as in a hierarchy, or just the fact that people just were born and raised in different places and they speak different languages or dialects? Personally, I like to say Mandarin is a dialect in order to sort of even out the hierarchy. And then, but when it comes to Hakka and Taiwanese, sometimes they say dialect, sometimes they say language. But just so everybody knows, like, they're mutually, like, you can't understand the other. It's sort of as different as Spanish is from Portuguese, right? Like if you listen carefully, you can maybe figure it out. But basically, these are different languages. Great. Thank you for those questions.
Thank you, Brian, for this explanation. Mr. Saad raised the hand. Go ahead, Mr. Saad.
Thank you, Brian. It was really eye-opener discussion, and thank you for opening the bigger picture for us. Because after I saw the movie, I just shrugged my shoulder and say, hey, okay, it was okay, it was just like good family movies and stuff. Wasn't really anything to write home about, But the venue of the discussion, the bigger picture, the history behind it makes a lot more sense. I'll now can probably watch it again and see your points. The language and the history that we had in mind for Taiwan was the Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan, and then the nationalists went there, and then they have been fighting over the identity and the country and the United Nations, and it's still going on, of course, after I don't know, 70 years. But I never had any idea about, the different languages, different dialects, different cultures that are all buried there, and the domination and the martial law that was lifted after so many years. It makes a lot more sense now. I wish I knew kind of this, this story before watching the movie. But thank you very much for choosing this movie, and also for the you gave us about the movie and about the setting. I don't have any question. I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to enjoy the discussion, the rest of the discussion.
Thank you. Definitely, if this is a case where we played this at the film festival, you would have heard a long introduction from me before, where I would have laid out some of this. So you mentioned like the Chiang Kai-shek, the government, and sort of that's sort of like the master narrative. I mean, all around the world, people know that narrative, but they know less about kind of how martial law, how propaganda was experienced on the ground. And one of the intriguing things about this movie that you see in some other Sha-shין movies too is once in a while you'll hear things on the radio, and what's being played on the radio, it's all in Mandarin. It's all kind of the official story of Taiwan. Like some big thing is happening. Maybe Taiwan just won some kind of battle against the communists, and they're playing that. Or another scene where I think the vice president passed away, and everyone is supposed to be very respectful in that moment. But you see actually how the people are paying attention and not paying attention to the official line. You get the sense that they're just going about their day. It does not seem to get in the way of the immediate issues of raising a family, of doing well in school, of, I don't know, fighting gangsters or something, or getting in fights at the pool hall. And so this is another like very sly way in which the film is saying that official history that we've all been taught, that we all grew up with, let's just remind ourselves, none of us cared. Like just remind us, like none of us really paid attention. And that is actually a very, very sly way of critiquing like decades of propaganda. To say not only, so the movie isn't political, like the movie isn't political in the sense that they're saying, no, we're gonna combat this history. All they had to say was, no, we just kept playing pool when that history was being made, when that official history was being made. So yeah, throughout the film, you can get these kind of sly critiques of the history that they were forced to learn when they were in school.
Yeah, there was a lots of point out, as you mentioned, the radio, the newspaper, the soldiers on the horses passing by, lots of different references to what's going on outside of the city or village, or what's happening, outside of this family life. So smartly, I believe that, Sha-shין mentioning what's going on, the late 40s and 50s, what's going on in the Taiwan. I want to ask you if you can go a little bit deeper about his style, and is all of his, because I saw when you mentioned again, I wasn't familiar with him, but I started watching his the previous film, the Summer Grand Spa, that
nice.
was a lovely movie, as well. And the next one, all of these screenplay actually is based on the childhood memory. The first one and the third one is based on his co-writers, memories, and obviously this film was his memories. His, style, is he continue to do his film through this type of the style? Because I read that he has another trilogy, about the history of Taiwan specifically, and his intention and interest to the history of Taiwan, it's interesting as well. So just if you can explain a little bit more about this issue as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, this film is one of several films that he was making about growing up, and yeah, you're right. Like the other ones, some of them were based on the memories of the writers, and I think it's important to think about it as memories. So there's something that's more innocent. A lot of these films are very nostalgic, so people in Taiwan watch them and they actually find them these kind of comforting movies because it's sort of like, that's how we used to do things. I remember showing this movie to my mom, and I mean, I love the movie, and I showed it to my mom. And I remember my mom said, "Oh yeah," she just had a running commentary the whole time. She said, "Oh yeah, we used to collect the wires on the ground so we could go sell them," and she had never told me any of these things before, right? So like the occasion of a movie to start talking about how we grew up, like that was also what was happening in the mid '80s. The movies about growing up were a way for people to finally be able to talk about these kinds of I mean, just the basic kind of reality of being poor, being rural, or yeah. So through these films, he developed this kind of long take aesthetic, and a lot of it was about like how do you film children. In one of these other films called The Boys from Feng Kui, I don't know if that's the one you mentioned. Oh, you mentioned Summer at Grandpa's, but the movie called Boys from Feng Kui, where no, actually no, it was Summer at Grandpa's, where these kids are just playing with the remote control car. Yeah. And then they start playing with the car is like playing with the turtle. And I think the scene goes on for like 8 minutes. And it's like all one take of just like a remote control car and a turtle. And so part of it is just utterly charming. But in another sense, this is very, very rigorous art cinema. So you have both of these impulses coming through, and they're both making him rather popular in the international scene. So I mentioned like that the martial law ended in 1987, and immediately his films changed too, because suddenly he was able to more explicitly start talking about, this isn't just how we grew up, it's also about how the government, like how the nation of Taiwan has developed in these years when we were growing up. So he made another trilogy. The most famous one is a film called The City of Sadness. He has another one called The Puppet Master, another one called Good Men, Good Women. So these films do also have a lot of long takes, like contemplative shots of people at a dinner table for a very long time. But he's starting to also become very, very kind of more explicitly experimental. So for instance, in Puppet Master and Good Men, Good Women, he actually jumps back and forth between different time periods, the present as well as the past, in order to start to examine, in almost like a modernist and postmodernist way, how the history is impacting the present, but also how the present is still active in trying to recuperate a history that was never told. And sort of the friction of past and present, the friction of the history that we thought we knew and the history that we are trying now to tell, he's starting to foreground these things. And so these films become experimental. Again, they're kind of arty, not just because of the long takes and the slowness, but arty also in just kind of how sophisticated he is in reminding us that history should not be taken for granted, that we are all part of the process of telling our own history now. They're kind of hard to explain without showing them. So if you ever have a chance to watch those films, they're very good. And then so after that, those films re-solidified his, like really made him a superstar internationally. So City of Sadness won the Venice Film Festival. And then basically after that, every movie he makes is at the Cannes Film Festival. He's in his 70s now, so he's really slowed down his filmmaking. His most recent film is called The Assassin. But even that one, before that, it was many years between films, and I mean, we don't know if he's gonna make another film now. And Taiwan cinema itself has changed a lot since. People often blame Sha-Shin for destroying the Taiwan film industry because they say, hey, like we used to have fun watching our soap operas type movies in the 70s, and now they're all slow movies because, I mean, economically, the markets, like the old institutions of making films, like all the old studios, they all went down. And I mean, the real culprit is actually Hollywood. It's not Sha-Shin, but Sha-Shin became a convenient scapegoat for the collapse of the Taiwan film industry. And local people in Taiwan kept saying, you're just making movies for foreigners. You're just making movies to win awards at international film festivals. And meanwhile, you're training all of these future filmmakers in Taiwan to make movies your way. And they win a lot of awards too. But, and so some of you may know filmmakers like Tsai Ming-liang, who are starting like the second wave of the Taiwan cinema. And then so in recent years, maybe the last 10 years or so, you have a resurgence of Taiwan cinema, but it is definitely a lot more in the style of Hollywood films and Japanese films.
Thank you, Brian. Sudaba has a question, and then Mr. Beruzian. Go ahead, Sudaba.
Thank you, Brian. It was wonderful, the explanation that you had. And I really enjoyed the two clips that you showed and you compared. And that also showed the expertise that this director has. Some directors, they want to use all the elements, you know, camera angle, lighting, music to evoke and intensify emotion as much as they can, while he's not, he's the opposite. And so I love that, you know, that keep everything very real and at the same time very impactful. I have a question regarding the movie. In there were, I believe, 3 or 4 scenes which was very specific for me. When I talked to Mahmoud, he didn't see it that way, and he was saying that every transition he was showing some part of nature. But for me, there were 3 or 4 scenes which the camera angle was mainly a sky. You would see sky, you would see maybe part of tree or wires, you know, those type of things. And it was for a quite some time. You would, you know, you see that scene, which I thought he should have some intention. So I couldn't figure it out. So please enlighten me if there was anything. Thank you.
Thank you for your observation. And it's one that a lot of critics, a lot of people have been very fascinated by in his films. And it has tempted a lot of people. A lot of the comparisons to the Japanese director Yasujiro Ozu are because of these sort of what they call like these interstitial shots, the shots between scenes that don't clearly belong to any of the scene before or after, yet clearly he wants us to look at it. Like he put that there for a reason. So the great French director Olivier Assayas was a big fan of Ho Shao-shen, even before any of his films were distributed in the United States. And he actually made a documentary with Ho Shao-shen in which he just walked around with Ho Shao-shen in his old neighborhoods in Taiwan. And he asked a very similar question directly to Ho Shao-shen. And Ho Shao-shen just said, so when I was a kid, I would just, you know, hang out. I would work out, just like he does in the movie. And sometimes he would just climb a tree and just like eat a sugar cane or something. And it was from that angle onto the world where you're suddenly an observer, where you can kind of hide. But you also take pleasure in just seeing and being someplace. We sort of, you don't have to be so embroiled in the drama of everyday life. And so for me, I don't think there's any one answer, but those moments allow me to take a breath. I'm not that this movie is that like intense or anything, but it's like a breath away from what seems to be very mundane, right? Like even nature itself is mundane too, but it's also kind of sublime. It also seems to belong in another maybe like higher place, like literally higher, I guess, but like in a place where we can escape the humdrumness. And in those moments, like that comes in. So maybe it's that. The other interpretation that I've always had for the film is, you mentioned the tree. There's this tree. I think there's only 2 trees that are very prominent outside of his house. And in so many of these long shots where we're kind of far from the action, the tree is prominent. The tree is way bigger than the people. And it's almost framed in a way that we see almost the entire tree. I wouldn't say necessarily like there's one meaning to this. It could just be the tree, right? But in thinking about Taiwan as a place where people come and go, right? There's such a temporariness. And to me, one of the most heartbreaking scenes of the movie is when the sister reads the father's memoir, and he says, basically like kind of like half apologizes to the family, saying, when we moved here, I didn't think we were going to stay, so I just got us the cheapest stuff, the stuff that's the most temporary stuff. But Taiwan to us was just like, it was a place where we were going to be for a quick stop, and then we would go back home, and they were never able to. And so you have all these people who nobody quite knows who belongs. And then you have this tree, and a tree that just seems like it's been here for centuries. And like there's nothing in Taiwan that feels like it's been here for centuries. I mean, except for the indigenous people who are always forgotten. Like no matter what, so we just have to acknowledge that. Even in Shao-Shin's films, they're not acknowledged. But I mean, aside from that, like what has been here forever? In a film that's so much a reflection on the temporary. And the things that just came and went, that there are these trees and there's the sky that's always been here in Taiwan. So that's how I like to look at those scenes.
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Beruzian, you have a question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes,
yeah, you mentioned about your mother. You're watching it with your mother, and your mother commented. I'm assuming that I know you're very, oriented with the art and cinema and everything. You're obviously a movie lover. I don't know about your mother, but I would consider her as an average mother in Taiwan. So if that's the case, is his movies is not just trophy movie or festival movies, is also popular like for average people? I mean, as that I didn't get that people are complaining about why destroying the soap opera movie, and now everybody is trying like in general. I would think that this kind of movie is just for like mostly intellectual or movie lovers, not for average people. That's one thing I was going to ask. And also I noticed also there are very powerful scenes in the movie in terms of death, like the father death or the mother illness, but the pneumonia, yes, and but the grandma's death, which is horrible, when they discovered that after 3 days they discovered her body and noticed that part of her body that is on the side of the floor was rotten. That was kind of surprising for me, because that was I know it was powerful and strong, because especially the way that he pictures the grandma is just so lovely and so live and everything, but not noticing her death for 3 days and being rotten, which smells probably horrible and everything. That there are some contradiction in terms of how they, because in his style, I noticed that his camera is not judgmental at all. He's trying to just show things the way they are. But that's what I'm sure. How is the new generation? I mean, how is the new cinema, or let's say not the Hollywood style, but in this kind of style is doing? I mean, are we have another younger director like him, or what do you think?
Okay, great. So first of all, I'm glad you mentioned my mom. So I was recall that I was not a very good Taiwanese person growing up, right? Like I was not that interested in Taiwan. Taiwan was just a place that was very hot that sometimes we went to on summer break. I understood some Mandarin. I mean, I went to Chinese school, but I was not very good. I understood Taiwanese because my mom spoke Taiwanese to her relatives. So I couldn't speak it, but I could understand it. It's very strange. I don't know how that happened. And then, so when I went to college, I mean, I moved away from home. I discovered this movie, and I was so excited to tell my mom that I like something from Taiwan. So part of it is like to brag, like I the stuff that's from like Taiwan's great filmmaker. I like him too. So I brought home the movie. This is years later, actually, after I got the DVD. Which I think got from eBay. It was very hard to get at the time. And then I told you I watched with my mom. The whole time she kept telling me, "Oh yeah, we did that too. We did that too." So in my mind, because by this point I was a big fan of Shao-Shin and did a lot of reading about how recuperating one's history it's an empowering act. To talk about how we grew up is very empowering. But like, as you suspected, my mom didn't care, right? She was just like, oh, so why is that a movie? Like, I did all those things. That's not a movie. A movie should have things that I don't know about, right? And I suspect a lot of people in Taiwan felt similarly. I mean, there is a certain kind of intellectual class in Taiwan that immediately understood kind of how daring this is and what an intervention in how films can be made. And it was, for them, it was legible in terms of, you know, like Italian neorealism and Japanese cinema. And for them, they were very excited that, you know, that Taiwanese cinema can do this too. So of all of Hou Hsiao-hsien's films, this was probably the most beloved one of his movies, because at the very least, you can have people watch it and say, that's how we grew up. Later on, he got more and more experimental. His most famous movie in Taiwan, and the one that made the most money, is the movie called The City of Sadness. It was immediately after martial law was lifted. He was going to tackle the most controversial massacre that happened in Taiwan, where these incoming government from China massacred thousands of local people. It's one of those things where, like, if you're growing up in Taiwan, everyone knew that this happened, but you just couldn't talk about it, let alone write about it, let alone make a movie about it. And so Hou Hsiao-hsien said, I'm going to make a movie about that incident. And this is like Schindler's List for Taiwan. It's like suddenly this big atrocity that happened is, we're going to get a movie version. But Hou Hsiao-hsien is Hou Hsiao-hsien. The movie has long takes. The violence that happens in the movie is always way, like, far in the distance. You could barely see it. Or sometimes, like, it's happening where the violence happens and then he moves his camera away so that we don't look at the violence. And for Hou Hsiao-hsien, this is a very ethical perspective too, to say, like, I'm going to deny us this horrible violence. We don't have to relive it. But you have this audience who, they've been waiting their entire lives to be able to enjoy seeing violence, like the violence that they heard about. So these are the kinds of things that made Hou Hsiao-hsien immediately controversial. It's sort of like, are you a populist or not? Because Hou Hsiao-hsien didn't grow up, he's not that well educated. He is that character in the movie. He didn't get into the college of his dreams. He ended up going to art school, which in Taiwan means you did not do well on your exams. But what happened was he surrounded himself with people who have very high art credentials. So Edward Yang, who studied filmmaking abroad, or his screenwriters. His primary screenwriter who helped co-write every one of his movies. Her name is Chu Tian-wen. She's probably considered the greatest novelist of her era in Taiwan. So he had working for her one of, like, the great postmodern novelists of Taiwan. And so their collaboration is so fascinating. You have one person who is not educated, who just likes to sit in a tree and eat sugarcane and watch the world, working with somebody who knows how to translate that into the terms of high art. And so he's always, like, kind of been between, like, highly populist, but also kind of alienating to the masses. And then I'll connect that with kind of what happened afterwards. Yeah, as I mentioned before, the recent directors in Taiwan have rejected his style, but there have been some filmmakers who have gone even further with it. And the director Tsai Ming-liang is most famous. I'll type his name in the chat in case you're curious. We play his films at the festival all the time. His long takes are even longer. It's like he can go on for like 10 minutes at a time, and they're so long that they're funny. Like, at some point, it's just ridiculous. If you see a character walking on one edge of the frame, you know that the camera is not going to stop until she's all the way onto the other side. and so the timing now is, like, he's more kind of modernist in that way, playful. Whereas Hou Hsiao-hsien isn't that playful. To him, this is just how he sees the world. Which is, I think, what makes him so incredible is that he's not trained as an artist. This is just how he sees the world. Whereas Tsai Ming-liang is kind of he knows what it's like to be an artist. And I'm glad you mentioned the scene with the grandma, which is, when you see it, it's traumatizing, right? It's like you said, it's so different than the other deaths that you witness, which are also unusual too, right? Like, the father passes away in kind of in the darkness. I mean, he didn't pass away right away, but it's like, it's not. It's both not dramatic, but also, like, so dramatic in, like, mother crying kind of way. But it's like the camera still not giving her the close-ups that you would see in the earlier generation, in the earlier decade of like soap opera. We see how the kids are reacting to their mom, and the kids are just, that they're sad, but they're also observers. So there's always a level of observation that's happening here, like even in these earlier deaths. But yeah, the grandma one is especially cruel. And yeah, it is indeed very non-judgmental. And part of it is because he's not trying to reduce these kinds of family problems to the level of morality. He's not saying that the kids just don't understand how to take care of the older generations anymore. Like, that's what the earlier kinds of films, the propaganda films would say, because the propaganda films want to teach kids how to be better kids, how to take care of the older generation, and by extension, take care of the governments and the nation. Whereas this new generation, I mean, they're obviously sad about it. Like, they don't feel great that grandma died that way, and they also feel guilty. But it's exactly what you said. But let's not be judgmental, right? Like, that we grew up this way. Maybe there are factors that led to this, or maybe we are just bad kids. Like, but this is what happened to us. These are our memories. How do we live on with it? After I watched that scene yesterday, I rewatched the film last night, and I was thinking about how when that scene, so you see how the grandmother rots, and then the narrator tells us the undertaker gave them just the dirtiest look. All the kids gave him a dirty look. And it was at that moment, to me, what I felt in that scene was, Sha-Shin is probably waiting his entire life to express to somebody how terrible he felt when somebody looked at him that way. And he just wanted to capture that moment, that emotion of feeling so stunned with guilt, but also being judged by somebody in the film, but also saying, like, I hope nobody necessarily judges me for this, but let me just tell you, this is what happened. And I just have to admit that this is what happened. And to me, this is such a different way of approaching to like owning up to one's own history. And it's so much more of an interesting way of acknowledging sort of the fact that we're not perfect, that we didn't grow up perfectly. But it also is just such a haunting moment, like the rigor mortis, when she's like turned over. And it's at that moment where it's sort of like, it's especially cruel in that moment. But also like how he ties that then to his memories of like when they were kids, and it's also like they've sort of been neglecting grandma this entire time. Like their entire childhood, they've been neglecting grandma. Grandma wants to go to the mainland. They're just like, oh, grandma's senile. You can't just walk to China, or she loses her way home. Nobody's concerned about grandma. They're just like concerned about paying the taxi driver when they bring her back. So in some ways, it's the culmination of a generation that was disconnected, and so that's kind of how I see the treatment of the older generation in the film.
Thanks, Brian. It's very similar to the kids who immigrant to another country or here, and their parents gonna be here. So that's how show that the real geographical of the Taiwan and China, the mainland and the villages. Anyway, I see two people raise their hand, Mr. Sad and Sudave, but before them, Mr. Abdi has a question. Go ahead, Mr. Abdi.
Good to see you again, Brian. Thank you for your time. It was very interesting movie that we saw. I don't want to say we enjoyed it. We enjoyed, but with the pain, we can relate to that type of the life. I want to talk about your mom first. I wish I was watching this movie with you and your mom, so I can have some answer towards all of my questions. Some of it I can directly, connect and realize, but that language barrier that you mentioned, I didn't know till you mentioned it. So I can go back and rewatch it again, see the movie. My question is, by the way, the younger generation, I saw it, they have special respect towards the elderly. One of the kids were but I don't know what happened at the end of the movie, and she died in that situation. Looking back to 40, 50, you know, when the time that movie, that story, the true story took place, living with the multicultural, not going back and looking at it, was that a good thing that happened to Taiwan or not so good thing? Can you mention some pros and cons about that mixture of the culture and beliefs and languages and military, you know, and all of those? Thank you again.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm suddenly thinking about like all the conversations I have with my dad, who like my dad is also very, he grew up that generation. He also grew up in Taiwan, born in Taiwan, like his family also like from, they've been in Taiwan for many years, for many generations. So he would say that it was a good thing because he benefited from it. Like my dad was somebody who got a good education, and it was an education that wouldn't have existed otherwise. He always talks about how, you know, like the Chinese, they came and they brought their values of wanting to get educated, of caring a lot about like making sure you do well in a test, and a test will allow you to succeed in society. That's like ingrained in everybody in Taiwan. It's also like just complicated by the fact that Taiwan had for 50 years before this been ruled by Japan. And it's sort of like, well, we are at least like ethnically Chinese. So these people who are coming in, they're sort of like us. Whereas Japan is clearly an outsider. But the problem was they weren't treated well. Like I mentioned, this huge massacre that happened in 1947. And under martial law, like you couldn't, the freedom of speech was heavily controlled, even more so than it was under Japanese rule. And so people are of different minds about it, right? So like in one sense, this new party, the KMT government with Chiang Kai-shek, they really built up Taiwan's infrastructure. They created relationships with the United States, which some people like, some people don't like. They built Taiwan into a major global economy in the 1980s and 90s. This is a result of the kind of result of propaganda. Like my dissertation, which became my book, was about a lot of these propaganda films and how they're all about how like what happens in a family helps to build the nation. And so you can see like it worked. Like all this propaganda in some ways worked. But of course, at what cost? The suppression of different kinds of voices, different political voices, cultural voices. And so a lot of the problems with internal problems of Taiwan today are people who are very conflicted about, are we Chinese, are we Taiwanese, especially with the People's Republic of China just lurking on the side. People's Republic of China, they love that Taiwan is is fighting each other because they're saying eventually you'll all need us again. And this is also very politically complicated. So yeah, so on the plus side, you do have infrastructure that's being built, but on the next side, like who stood to gain from that? And I just want to like remind everybody, like the indigenous people have not been part of this conversation at all. Kind of the same way that's in the United States. Like in the United States, we have this conversation about multiculturalism that actually does not include like native voices. And in Taiwan, a similar thing has happened until very recently, at least. I'm not a political scientist of Taiwan, so I can't say more, but I hope that I've given you a little bit of a sense of the different sides of this.
Thanks, Brian. Again, I see that Sudavar and Mr. Sad has raised his hand, but since Mr. Fardin has any question yet, go ahead, please. Fardin John, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Brian. I've enjoyed the movie and your lectures and so on. And I think apart from the similarities between the movie style and the filmmakers like Ozu or even Kurosawa, especially in the fighting scenes. I think it is this style. It's about how not to tell a story. Like some filmmakers in Iran, we know them as legends, like Sohrab Shahid Saleh, who has passed away, but his movies, I don't know if Sha-Shin has seen these movies, or of course Kiarostami, somehow Kiarostami, and I wanted to know if like are having this style in camera movements and how not to tell a story, and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people's frustration with the film is the fact that it lacks cause and effect, right? Like you have an action that happens in one scene that has no impact on what happens in the next scene. like we get to know these kids, like they collect stamps. We never hear about that again. Or like he goes to the brothel. We don't really hear about that again. Like, does that actually impact anything that happens later on? Or maybe I guess in the second half, you get a little bit more cause and effect. Like what happens in what this scene might relate to what happens to the mom later on. But it's very, very flimsy. Where you get sort of like shards of memories. I mean, there's a way like when I remember my childhood, I don't remember, there's no narrative to my childhood, but I have like individual like flashes of, oh, I remember this happened in this house. I remember this gathering that we had. I remember this picture that we took. And this movie also has a lot of pictures, like people are constantly taking pictures in this movie, because I think it's also a reminder of that's how we remember the past, like through the photographs that we have of it. And so that I think that tactic of not telling a story is his way of being authentic to how we remember, and that we remember not in terms of narrative, but in terms of kind of figments. Your comparison with Iranian cinemas is great, and it's actually I'm gonna secretly say it was one of the reasons I picked a Sha-Shin movie, because so I mentioned I discovered Sha-Shin when I was in college, but that's also when I watched like films like Makhmalbaf and Kiarostami, and I came to love these directors at the same time, and I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think it's no coincidence that I was learning from both filmmakers about what is possible in film, or filmmakers from Iran and Taiwan. And it was really just Iran and Taiwan. Like to me, like I always connect these two cinemas. And I'm just gonna put in the chat here, because this article by Jonathan Rosenbaum was actually very formative for me. This is an article in which he actually explicitly compares. He says in Taiwan, the two leaders in world cinema are Taiwan and Iran. And in both countries, we have two major filmmakers. In Iran, you have Kiarostami and you have Makhmalbaf, and in Taiwan, you have Edward Yang and you have Sha-Shin. He says Sha-Shin is like the Kiarostami, and then Edward Yang is like the Makhmalbaf film. And so like this is always, I mean, I think this is a huge reduction. Obviously, these are very different national cinemas in very different places. But that excitement of like these connections that we can make around the world has always animated my like hunger to go to film festivals and to read criticism. And then it's always really exciting, like when I find out that Sha-Shin and Kiarostami, they knew each other, like they would run into each other at all these film festivals, and maybe, and they both love Ozu. so maybe we're talking about national cinemas and national traditions, and that's very important. But the interchange of ideas within the kind of global art cinema circuit is so valuable. And for me is like what we are doing today is also part of that tradition of like what film festivals can do to bring different voices together and different traditions.
Thank you. Mr. Saad, you have a question?
Thanks again, Brian. It's, the conversation is giving me a chance to rethink some of the scenes and stuff. Something was bothering me. Yes, I was watching it, that there was no indication or no sign of dates, because they started in 1949. When Taiwan, it was as you know, we discussed. And then there was no indication or any sign of how many years has passed. And now that I'm more familiar with the filmmaker and the view, I know that his point of view is from that kid, and the kid doesn't care about it. You know, they're growing up together, and you know, the matter is 52 or 54. And that's one thing that I got my answer. Another thing was that Taiwan was the center of PRC at the time. And so the martial law and the political government and everything, it is hardly any indication in the movie. Is it because that's from the point of view of a kid that is watching this whole? Because the same time, you know, at the same time in the mainland, you have the crisis and the wars and cultural revolution, all those things is happening. Not a little bit later, but again, there are a lot of action is happening in Taiwan. I'm sure that there was a lot of others, but there's no indication in the movie. It barely shows some soldiers and barely, you know, military, the cops that they came in to break that fight. It was for that's again going back to the point of view of the kid.
Yeah, very much. I mean, there are other films from that around this period, especially after 1987, after martial law was lifted, where you have films that are more explicitly about, for instance, like someone's father gets abducted by the government because of things that he had said, and he just disappears for years. So you have films like that that come up after 1987. So yeah, it's about children, and therefore the kids just don't read the world that way. But it's also a convenience. It's because they're still under martial law. You still can't quite say that yet. But it is interesting. Yeah, there are no dates in it, and because kids don't know dates. But it's also the sense that like dates are to organize Taiwan history according to dates is that's sort of like the way we tell history in the textbooks. And this is very much a approach to history that is not the textbooks way, because in Taiwan the textbooks are suspect. And so he was looking for a new style to encounter history, to recollect history that was kind of radically different than the mainstream ways of telling history. There are like little markers. So for instance, like the death of the vice president, and then you hear it on the radio. And so if you grew up then, you might know, oh, okay, so I know, so that's what year it was. But it's done in a way that makes you feel like, oh, where was I on that day, right? As opposed to, oh, that was a big day in our nation's history. So it's sort of like it brings down these national momentous moments to the level of the everyday and how it's experienced. And but you're right. The difference between this and what's happening in China, the communist China, is radically different, because there you feel like the changes of history a lot more like it's in your life in a lot more of a powerful way. And so maybe it's just like, I don't know, like Taiwan as like a benevolent dictatorship or something, where they're not as interested in like ruining your life. As long as you play by the rules, then everything will be fine. As long as you study hard, everything, you won't have to worry about it. But it's still present, and as these shards of memories. I love like that some of you have mentioned the horses. It's this weird moment that there's nothing before that scene indicates that that's going to happen. And nothing after that scene like alludes back to the fact that horses ran through their town in the middle of it. And so it's like, yeah, the presence but non-presence, the threat but non-threat of kind of martial law at all times. Yeah, so it's a very kind of unique way of telling that history.
Thank you, Brian. We are approaching at our 9 o'clock, and I don't want to make more time of the other people, but there's only one last question. Sudha, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, please.
Thank you. One is a comment, the other one is a question, and I make it very brief. I think the grandma's death, the story and the scene was very, very impactful, and I thought that made this, for me at least, that made this movie excellent movie because I thought it was an attempt to the heroism as well as showing the cruelty of life, and this is the reality. And if it was happy ending or even then it wouldn't be the movie that I enjoy. Not that I like sad scenes, but I hope I can express what I had in mind. But my question here is, when father died and they were mourning, which was very similar to Iran and the way that we, have, breathe. But there were discussion regarding a cat, and so in Murakami's stories, most of Murakami's story, cat is a big motive. And immediately I went to, okay, is it, influenced by Japanese, stories? Or so I really would like to know if there is anything related. Thank you.
I guess Murakami, like his novels would be coming a little bit later, so I don't know if they're related. But cats figure prominently in Japanese culture, so maybe that feeds into it. I mean, so when I see that scene, and they go on and even the way that they're telling the story of the cat, it's kind of just goes on and on. You're like, where are you going with this? So the presentation of it for me, like, just reminds me of, this is just the way that like old people talk, or like the older generation, in trying to like tell us like these old stories of like, oh, I heard this happened. So for me, like, it also factors into just like these the tales that we tell each other, and so it feeds into like superstition in Taiwan. So I think for me, it's like how kids learn about these superstitions and tales of cultural tales. So I don't know if there's anything like specifically meaningful to the cat. I'll ask somebody next time. Like, maybe if I see somebody really interested in cats in Taiwan, I'll bring this up. But otherwise, I can't think of anything. But your comment about grandma reminded me of something else that's very interesting about this movie. So the last scene of the movie is grandma's death, and it has that kind of impact, like that emotional impact that much of the movie doesn't have because it's so detached. And it reminded me that the movie begins with the director. I mean, so you hear a narrator, that's Sha-Shien himself. And he begins the movie by saying, this is a story about my father. And then the movie has barely the father in it. And it really ends with the grandma. And so I'm not quite sure what to make of this. Maybe this is just bad storytelling, or maybe it's like a way of I don't know, like maybe he's pressured into like caring so much about the father. Maybe there's something confusion about that. Like, I should tell my father's story or talk about like how important my father was in my own development. Or maybe the film is about the absence of a father. But whatever it is, it ends up with the grandmother. And yeah, so maybe everyone can make of that what they will. But I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Brian. I know this. I have at least a few more questions, but I don't want to. We already passed the 9 p.m. and I don't want to people who's going to be standing on this program anymore. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you everyone for joining us. I believe we always enjoying, coming to the film festival and enjoying, your selected movie, which is, I really praise your choices, all around the Asia. I know that the showcase, spring showcase is coming up next couple of months. Do you have any news for us, especially for the Iranian community?
Well, I'm still working on this lineup. As you might imagine, it's hard to program films these days because films aren't being released in the same way. Yeah. And a lot of distributors are reluctant to give us films until they've played in theaters in their home country. but I have been able to, I have a film from Taiwan. What else do I have? I booked a mini series from Japan. Like, I don't know how that's gonna go. It's like a 10-part TV series. What else do I have? I have a Filipino kind of a drama thriller. But I also booked, and this is still very, like, this is not public, but I'll share it with you all because I know it matters to that you might care. But I booked the new Majidi film, Sun Children, which is quite spectacular.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's one of it's actually included in the shortlist for the Best Foreign Oscar. Hopefully it's going to be made it to the 5 top nominees, but it is a great movie. I saw it too. I really appreciate that you always bring in, trying your best to bring in at least one Iranian film to the Asian Film Festival in San Diego.
I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone for always showing up, and that means so much to me, and it means so much to see all of your faces today. It's been a while.
Of course. Hopefully soon, probably not this April, but hopefully by November we can have in person, film festival and gathering up in the movie theater and watch film together and then talk about it.
Absolutely.
If you want to add anything to the your comments, please go ahead, and otherwise we're going to say goodbye.
I mean, I'll just quickly say, because you had mentioned this before and how you feel like a film like this can speak to immigration everywhere, like a lot of people and I feel like this film resonated with me because my family is also one that where languages are disappearing with each generation. And for me, it's like a second generation immigrant in the United States. This film tells me more about immigration than most films about immigration to the United States that I've seen. Maybe because of the style, maybe because of like the non-judgmental approach. And so it's really lovely to hear that kind of you felt that too. And perhaps it's a reminder that these films can resonate in surprising ways.
Of course, yes. Thank you very much. Everyone, thank you very much for joining us. Our next program next month, actually we are going to have program on March 25th, and our guest is going to be Mr. Mahmoud Berhuzian, the actor and director. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening, and hopefully everybody is going to be safe and this pandemic is going to be end soon. Have a good night.
Thank you.